She left for work, but the rancher found a letter in her cabin that broke his silence. Wyoming Territory, 1884. The valley town lay crouched between red buttes and dust storms, a place where the wind carried secrets farther than voices and silence weighed heavier than iron. The dawn chill pressed against the land, drawing silver breath from the earth itself. Lydia pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped from her cabin. She moved with brisk certainty, her braid trailing down her back, her boots crunching the frostbitten dirt. She had work waiting in town, the seamstress shop with its endless mending and fitting, but in that hushed hour she thought only of the steady rhythm of her walk. The air smelled of sage and horses, the sky still soft with the pale blue of early light. She paused just once, glancing toward the horizon as if measuring how far the day might carry her. Then she disappeared down the track, her figure swallowed by cottonwoods in distance. Behind her, the cabin stood plain and small, built of logs weathered gray, its roof patched by careful hands. Smoke lingered faintly from the chimney, curling like a memory that refused to fade. Inside, the room was neat, swept with care, a single bed folded smooth, a rough-hewn table, a lamp still cool from the night's rest. Nothing suggested danger. Nothing hinted at the folded paper that lay waiting on the table, placed as though the devil himself had walked in and left his calling card. Elias arrived not long after she had gone. He rode slow, as was his habit, shoulders heavy with years that had carved his face into stone. His horse, a roan with scars along its flank, carried him with a patience matched only by the man himself. Elias was known in the valley as a widower who spoke little and fought less, a man whose silence stretched back so far most had forgotten the sound of his voice. They called him watchful, they called him strange, but no one called him weak. He dismounted at Lydia's door, the leather creaking beneath his weight. Over one arm he carried a sack of flour, plain charity, though he never named it so. He had promised her father once, in a barn thick with hay and whiskey, that he'd keep an eye on the girl if misfortune struck. That promise had outlived her father, outlived Elias's own wife, outlived the soft years of youth. It was a brand burned deep into his spirit, and brands, Elias knew, could never be rubbed away. He pushed the cabin door open with his boot, the hinges groaning softly. The place was empty, holding only the hush of a young woman's careful life. He set the flour on the counter, his eyes wandering not out of nosiness but out of habit, tracing the corners of the room. That was when he saw it, a letter lying neat beneath the lamp, its seal broken, its presence unnatural in its stillness. Elias reached for it, calloused fingers hovering as though touching it might invite something darker than ink. He drew the paper free, unfolding it slowly. The words leapt against him, scrawled sharp and uneven, carved from spite rather than penmanship. Your father's debt was never paid. A blood price waits, and it will be taken from the blood he left behind. Men ride, and they ride for you. The rancher's breath caught, the paper trembling faintly in his grip. He read it again, slower, letting the venom of each word sink deep. The room seemed to shrink, its shadows growing long as if leaning in to hear his response. For a moment he stood motionless, staring at the letter, and then his voice broke the stillness like a hammer through glass. God writes in silence, but man breaks it with lies. His own words startled him. He hadn't heard his voice fill a room in months, maybe years. It sounded foreign, heavy, alive with something that had lain buried too long. He closed his eyes and saw faces he tried to forget, graves scattered on hillsides, men who had once sworn brotherhood and instead spilled blood. Outlaws never forgot debts, and this letter carried the weight of a past he had prayed would stay buried. Elias folded the page carefully, though his hands shook. He placed it back on the table, staring at it like one might stare at a snake coiled and waiting. His silence had been his shield, his chosen prison. But silence could not save Lydia. She walked blind into a storm her father had summoned years ago, and if he left her ignorant, her blood would be the toll collected. "This ain't just a letter," he muttered, the gravel in his voice echoing off log walls. "It's a death warrant folded neat." The horse outside shifted, hoofs striking stone, as if sensing the change in its master. Elias reached for his hat, pulling it low, his jaw tight. He had sworn never to pick up the pieces of who he once was, but some vows weighed heavier than silence. Protecting her mattered more than burying himself. He stepped back into the cold light of dawn, the wind tugging at his coat. He swung into the saddle with the ease of muscle memory, the revolver at his side pressing against his ribs like an old friend demanding to be remembered. He reined the roan toward town, eyes fixed on the horizon where the roofs began to show against the pale morning sky. "If she don't know," he whispered, voice sharp as spurs. She will. The horse leapt forward, hooves pounding earth, dust curling in their wake. The prairie spread wide, endless and raw, but Elias's gaze never wavered from the trail. Lydia was somewhere ahead, shawl pulled close, steps light, her thoughts tangled with ribbons and cloth instead of danger. She had no idea that shadows already moved behind her. High on the ridges, figures watched. Men with dust-choked faces and eyes sharp as hawks. They leaned in their saddles, silent shapes against the rising sun, spurs glinting. Their presence was a promise, one written in the same ink as the letter on her table. Elias urged his horse faster, each stride shaking the earth. The letter's words pulsed in his mind, each line a drumbeat pushing him forward. A debt of blood. Men coming to collect. Lydia the price. The valley air grew thick, the silence alive with foreboding. The land itself seemed to wait, to listen, to witness what came next. Elias knew in his bones the time for silence was gone. The voice he had buried with his wife would have to rise again, and when it did, the men who stalked Lydia would learn that quiet could thunder louder than any gun. The town loomed closer, smoke lifting lazy from chimneys, dogs barking faintly in the distance. Yet Elias's eyes stayed on the shadows in the canyon, the glints of steel and the restless motion of horses hidden among rocks. His heart beat steady, not fast, not slow, but certain. He would reach her before they did. He had to. But the shadows did not wait. They shifted, closing in like wolves on a lamb, and Lydia, walking steady into town, had no idea that before the sun reached its height, her life, and his silence, would be forever broken. The bell above the seamstress shop door gave a small metallic chime as Lydia stepped inside, the warmth of the room closing around her like a shawl. Bolts of fabric leaned against the wall, their colors muted by dust but still holding whispers of elegance. She brushed the cold from her sleeves and moved behind the counter, setting her needle and thread to work while the morning drifted into rhythm. From the window she caught sight of movement across the street. Two men she did not recognize stood near the hitching post, their shoulders squared, their eyes fixed not on the saloon or the smithy but on her. One leaned against a rail, chewing a stalk of grass, his stare unwavering. The other shifted now and then, tapping his boot against the post, yet his gaze never strayed far. She tried to tell herself strangers passed through all the time, but the weight of their attention pricked at her spine. She lowered her eyes to the fabric in her lap, stitching with steady fingers though her pulse betrayed her. When she dared to glance again, they were still there, the kind of men who didn't wander aimlessly but lingered with intent. Something about them carried dust not just from the trail but from darker roads. The door creaked open behind her. Elias stepped in, his broad figure filling the threshold. He said nothing, but his eyes swept the room, catching hers before shifting to the window. She saw his jaw tighten, the set of his shoulders stiffen as if some buried memory had risen sudden and sharp. Without a word he crossed to the door again, pushing it open with deliberate force. He strode into the street, boots striking hard against packed earth. The two strangers straightened, one with a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. "You boys lost?" Elias asked, his voice low, steady, and edged with something that cut deeper than volume. The taller of the two spat to the side, never taking his eyes off him. "Ain't lost. Just looking at the wares." His glance flicked toward the shop window where Lydia stood frozen, hands gripping the counter. Elias's eyes narrowed, his silence thick as a storm about to break. For years he had kept it, worn it like armor, but the recognition that sparked in the second man's eyes stripped it away. "That's him," the men muttered, voice carrying like a snake's hiss. "That's the rancher who went quiet after the war." The word spread through the street like sparks on dry grass. Heads turned, whispers lifted. Elias's name had not been spoken loud in years, but now it hung there, exposed, raw. Lydia's heart pounded as she pressed closer to the glass, trying to understand what shadow of the past clung to him. The first man smirked wider. "Heard stories about you. Scout who vanished after a canyon ran red. Whole company dead but you. Folks said you carried maps in your head and knives in your boots. Thought maybe you were a ghost. Guess ghosts can ride horses and bring flour to girls now." Elias didn't flinch. His voice came quiet, deliberate. "Silence is a man's armor, till someone rips it off." The smirk faltered for a breath. Then the men leaned closer, menace rising in his tone. "Her father's sins are older than her. Doesn't matter if she stitches dresses or prays in church, debts outlive bloodlines." Lydia stumbled back from the window, the words piercing like nails. Her father. Always her father. She had buried him years ago, with more questions than answers, but now his shadow returned with fangs. Elias's eyes hardened, his hand drifting near the revolver at his hip. "If they touch her," he said, voice iron, "the plains will drink blood again." A silence settled, sharp and deadly. The two men shifted, one tugging his hat lower, the other sneering but unwilling to push further in the open street. They turned slowly, walking away toward their horses, but the tension clung heavy in their wake. Inside, Lydia felt her knees weaken. She pressed a hand against the counter to steady herself, confusion and fear warring in her chest. What had her father done that strangers would ride from nowhere to claim debts with her life? Why did Elias, the man who barely spoke, carry a voice like thunder when it came to her name? The rest of the day passed in uneasy fragments. Customers came and went, but her thoughts tangled around the men outside, around the words they had thrown like daggers. She caught Elias's shadow moving past the window more than once, his figure steady, watchful, like a wall holding back a storm. By late afternoon the light had turned amber, slanting across the town. Lydia gathered her things, her fingers clumsy with the needle, her breath quick with worry. She stepped out onto the boardwalk, the cool air wrapping around her. Elias appeared almost at once, as if he had been waiting in the dust itself. "You need to walk home with me," he said, his voice more command than request. She bristled, confusion flickering into defiance. "Why? What aren't you telling me?" His eyes, dark and steady, held hers with weight. "Not here. Not now. But you can't walk alone." She opened her mouth to argue, to demand the truth, when the world split with a sound that made her blood freeze. A gunshot cracked from the alley to her left, sharp as lightning tearing the sky. The boards beneath her feet trembled with the echo. Elias moved instantly, stepping between her and the sound, his hand on his revolver, eyes narrowed toward the shadows where smoke still curled. The air thickened, the town holding its breath. Lydia's heart thundered, her father's ghost pressing closer, and in that moment she knew, whatever silence Elias had kept, it had shattered, and the men who rode for her were already here. The crack of the gunshot had barely died when the alley spat smoke again. Elias shoved Lydia down against the wooden boards, his body shielding hers as splinters flew. His revolver was out before the echo finished rolling through town. He fired once, twice, the bullets ripping into shadow. One of the strangers staggered into view, clutching his shoulder, teeth bared in pain. The other jerked his pistol up, but Elias's third shot cut the air faster, and the men fell into the dust with a grunt that turned silent. Screams rose from the street. Storefront doors slammed, curtains twitched. Lydia trembled beneath Elias's arm, the sharp tang of gunpowder stinging her nose, the world around her thunderous with fear. She clutched at him, half in terror, half in disbelief at the violence that had erupted in a heartbeat. The wounded outlaw spat into the dirt, his eyes fixed not on Elias but on Lydia. "You think we'll stop with two? He's still alive, girl. He's been alive all these years, and he wrote you first." Elias's boot connected with the man's chest, knocking him flat before he could say more. But the words lingered like a rattlesnake's rattle in the air. Lydia's breath hitched. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide with horror. "What is he talking about? Who wrote me?" Elias holstered his revolver, jaw tight. He did not answer. He took her arm, lifting her to her feet, pushing her toward his horse as more townsfolk spilled into the street. His silence was heavier than the gunfire had been. At the ranch, the wind swept through the valley, carrying the smell of sage and rain. Elias dismounted and helped Lydia down, though she pulled away from his hand the moment her boots touched dirt. Her eyes burned with questions he refused to meet. "You knew," she said finally, voice shaking. "You knew something. That letter, you saw it before I did." He turned, his hat brim shadowing his face. For a long while he said nothing, only stared across the fields where the wheat bent low in the evening wind. "I buried my father not knowing the truth," Lydia said, her voice cracking. "And you," she jabbed her finger toward his chest, "you stood there in my cabin, knowing, and still said nothing." His throat worked as if words fought to rise. At last, his voice came out, gravel thick. "Every grave I left behind still rides with me." The word struck her like a blow. She stared at him, confusion tangling with anger. "That's not an answer. That's a riddle. My father's sins, his blood debts, why are they mine to carry now? Why didn't you tell me?" He stepped closer, his eyes hard and haunted. Because telling you would have set a fire I couldn't put out. Because some truths don't heal, they just cut deeper. Tears blurred her vision. She wanted to scream, to claw at him, to tear the silence from his chest. Instead, her voice dropped to a whisper. I wanted to hate you for keeping it from me, but hate don't heal wounds. Something inside him cracked then. He drew in a breath, as though the air itself burned. He had lived years in silence, believing it was his penance. But the look in her eyes demanded more than silence could give. I was a scout, he said, voice low, steady, carrying the weight of confession. The war pulled me into the canyons. I led men where maps ended, where shadows swallowed sound. And I led them wrong. An ambush came down like thunder. By nightfall, I was the only one left breathing. Their screams never left me. Every dawn since, I've carried them, a company of ghosts marching in my silence. That's why I went quiet. That's why I stayed away. Lydia's hands trembled at her sides. She had expected betrayal, cowardice, even cruelty. She had not expected guilt carved so deep it had stolen his voice for years. She saw him then not as the silent rancher but as a man drowning under graves no one else could see. Her voice faltered but held. Then let me bleed for the truth, girl, he muttered, almost to himself, eyes fixed on the horizon. If the plains demand blood, they'll take mine before yours. The wind rattled the barn door. Night stretched its shadow over the ranch, but the air was alive with words that could not be unspoken. Lydia stood in silence, torn between anger and understanding, between fear and the strange pull of trust. The moment cracked when the roan whinnied sharp. Elias's eyes snapped to the yard. On the ranch door, nailed deep into the wood, a letter flapped in the wind. Its edges curled, but the ink stood bold, dark, deliberate. Lydia moved toward it, heart pounding. Elias was there first, tearing it free with one hand. The paper unfolded in his grip. The words were short, cruel, final. Next, the girl. We ride at dawn. The night deepened around them, silence broken not by wind, not by words, but by the unspoken certainty that the past was no longer content to haunt. It was coming to claim. The dawn came restless, the sky torn in red streaks as if warning the land of what was to come. Elias saddled the roan in silence, his hand steady though the air around him was tight with unease. Lydia stood nearby, clutching her shawl, her face pale but her eyes resolved. She had argued through the night, begged him to let her face whatever shadow hunted her, but Elias had decided. The canyons offered the only chance to shake men who rode like wolves. He swung into the saddle and reached down, pulling her up behind him. She settled against his back, her grip hesitant at first, then firm when the horse shifted. Without another word, Elias urged the roan forward, and the ranch fell behind them like a memory already fading. The trail wound into the canyon, walls of sandstone rising steep and jagged, painted gold by the low sun. The air was dry, the kind that cracked lips and carried sound too far. Every hoofbeat echoed, bouncing between cliffs, betraying their passage. Elias scanned the ridges, his body taut as a drawn bow. He had walked men into death before. He would not do it again if he could help it. The wind don't fear men, he muttered, voice barely above the breeze. But men should fear the wind tonight. Lydia leaned closer to hear him. What do you mean? He didn't answer, only urged the horse faster. She turned her face into the rising wind, and she understood. It howled through the canyon in bursts, carrying grit sharp as glass, bending mesquite trees, drowning sound. It was a warning and a cover both. They had not gone far when shadows split from the cliffs. Gunfire cracked, echoing like thunder trapped in stone. The roan reared, Lydia clutching Elias's coat as he pulled hard on the reins. Figures rode down from the heights, rifles flashing in the glare. The outlaws had been waiting. Elias spurred the roan hard, weaving through the canyon floor as bullets split rock beside them. Lydia's heart hammered, but her fear sharpened into steel when she saw one raider bearing down, pistol raised. Instinct overrode terror. She grabbed Elias's spare revolver from the saddle holster, her hand shaking but determined. She fired once. The shot cracked wild, but the second struck true, grazing the outlaw's arm and knocking him off his horse. Elias glanced back, shock flickering in his eyes before settling into grim approval. Hold steady, he barked. You got grit, girl. The canyon narrowed, the wall squeezing them into a chokehold. A storm whipped dust into the air, stinging their eyes, cloaking the riders in a shifting veil. Elias guided the roan toward a cut in the rock, a hidden trail only someone with a scout's memory could recall. But the gang was relentless, their whoops echoing through the storm like devils riding the wind. "If I fall," Elias shouted over the storm, "you ride. Don't you dare look back." Her arms tightened around him, defiance burning through her fear. "I ain't leaving you, rancher. Silence or not, you're all I got." The words struck harder than any bullet. For years he had borne his silence like armor, but her voice pierced through, raw and unyielding. He felt the weight of it even as he fired back at their pursuers, each shot precise, each movement honed by memory he had tried to bury. The canyon walls split into a wider basin, the storm funneling dust until the world turned red and blind. Elias drove the roan into the chaos, but the gang closed fast, circling like wolves at the kill. Gunfire burst around them, the echoes confusing direction. One shot struck the roan's flank. The horse screamed, stumbling, and Elias and Lydia were thrown hard into the dust. Elias rolled at his feet, shoving Lydia toward a cluster of rocks. "Stay low," he growled, drawing his rifle as riders bore down. He fired again and again, dropping two before the third slammed into him, knocking the weapon from his grip. Rough hands seized him, a rope looped fast around his arms, yanking them tight. Lydia crouched in the rocks, dust caking her face, her chest heaving as she watched him struggle. Every instinct screamed to run, but her body refused. She clutched the revolver close, hidden from sight, her eyes wide with fury and fear. The gang leader, a gaunt man with eyes like coal, stepped forward, spitting into the dirt. Well, the quiet rancher finally makes noise." He yanked Elias's head back by the hair, grinning as blood trickled down his cheek. "Your silence don't save you now." Elias stared back, unflinching, though his arms strained against the ropes. "You want me. You got me. Leave the girl." The leader laughed, the sound jagged. "The girl's the price. You just sweeten the pot." Lydia pressed deeper into the rocks, heart pounding so loud she thought they might hear it. Her grip on the revolver tightened. She had saved Elias once in the canyon, and she would again if chance allowed. But for now, she stayed hidden, unseen, while the outlaws bound Elias to a horse and turned him toward the storm's heart. The dust swirled, choking the air, and the canyon swallowed their figures. Lydia crouched alone among the stones, watching them drag him away, her breath shallow, her resolve hardening. They thought her weak, thought her father's sins had left her defenseless. They would learn different. Above, the wind howled through the cliffs like a ghost's cry, carrying the echo of Elias's capture into the night that was coming.